Chapter 1 is the study of child and adolescent development. There are two areas we will cover in this first chapter, and these are very brief overviews. First, we will talk about developmental theories, which we will cover throughout the semester, and we will also study child development from a research methodology perspective. We will raise a virtual child in this class, and although we will not start yet, please do not begin raising your virtual child. I do want you to start thinking about what type of parent you think you might be. Now, we will have very strict guidelines, so please do not begin until we're ready. We'll start talking about developmental theories, but first we want to define what development is. It's basically a relatively permanent change in behavior, thinking, or of emotions over the course of time. And developmental theories are a framework that help us by giving us a set of rules or statements that enable us to describe, explain, and predict various aspects of development. We begin talking about developmental theories with evolutionary theories. And here we see Konrad Lorenz, who was an evolutionary theorist, and he examined how humans adapt to the environment to survive. And this includes areas of ethology, of evolutionary developmental psychology, as well as attachment theory. Now, Konrad Lorenz, he coined the term imprinting, which is based on his research in which baby geese followed him as though he were their mother. There are sensitive periods that are time frames in which the person or animal is most receptive to certain experiences. So when baby geese are born, the first thing they see, they assume is their mother. Psychodynamic theories are where we see conflicting forces, and these conflicting forces can impact early experience. There are two psychodynamic theorists. The first is Sigmund Freud. He's kind of the father of psychodynamic theory, and he believed that there were three parts of a person's personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. And he also developed 5 stages of what he called psychosexual development. So according to Freud, he believed development occurred through sexual impulses, and this started at infancy. Erik Erikson was a student of Freud's, and he expanded Freud's theory, and he called it a psychosocial theory, not psychosexual development, where he believed that social and emotional development included societal expectations, and he is also a stage theorist. So Freud and Erikson are considered stage theorists. Learning theories are where we see the role of the environment and how it explains development. Many of you might be familiar with the term classical conditioning, and here we have responses to stimuli, and typically we've trained rats or birds, for example, to press a bar, and when they learn that when they press the bar they get food. Or for example, studies where rats are put in a maze and they figure out the way to the end where the food is. Operant conditioning is also a learning theory where we use either punishment or reinforcement to change behavior. Oftentimes, operant conditioning will be used for bedwetting, for example. Social learning theory is where we use modeling and observation as well as imitation. Albert Bandura is one of the leading social learning theorists that we will cover in this class. So, thinking about classical conditioning and childhood fears, for example, one or more of you may have observed a childhood fear in a child, or maybe you have developed one yourself. Think about how the fear developed and how might classical conditioning principles apply in explaining the development of that fear. I'm posting videos on a lot of these concepts to better help understand kind of what it is and how we're able to modify or change behaviors throughout this learning process. Cognitive theories help describe and explain how children think, how they develop language, how they develop memory, and other processes that could change with development. Now, Jean Piaget is the leading cognitive developmental theorist, and again, he's also a stage theorist, and he believed that children actively construct knowledge in terms of schemas. So we have schemes for everything, and we'll cover this in more detail later. But he had 4 stages of development. And Piaget's stages begin with sensory motor, and this is basically birth to 2 years, where infants understand their environment through their senses and motor actions. If you think about an infant, because they're unable to communicate, how they learn, so cognitive development, how they learn is through their senses, by touching, by seeing, by smelling, by hearing. They're using their senses to learn in their environment. And as we get through to 2 years, they're able to use simple symbols such as words and pretend play. The second stage is pre-operational, which is 2 to 6 years. And here, children use symbols, things like language or imagery, to advance communication and thinking, and they tend to focus on only one point of view at a time. So it's very narrow in thinking. As we get into concrete operational, 6 to 12 years, children are able to develop internal mental operations that allow for more logical thinking. The final stage, the formal operational stage, goes from 12 years to adulthood. And here we see abstract thinking and problem-solving abilities where we can formulate and test hypotheses using some type of scientific method. We're moving out of stage theories now, and we're getting into other types of theories that are more holistic in view. So in the stage theorists, you kind of have to progress from one stage in order to get to the next stage. Lev Vygotsky, his theory was called the socio-cultural theory, where he believed that historical and cultural factors influence how we learn. And learning takes place in social contexts, where more expert members of society, typically parents or adults, interact with children, and this is how children learn. Information processing theories, they view cognitive systems are like computers, whereas developmental cognitive neuroscience theories, it's more of an interdisciplinary approach to understanding the relationship between changes in the brain and how it relates to behavior and how our thinking changes. And we're able to view this through fMRIs, which are functioning magnetic resonance imaging. And these are kind of like x-rays, or if any of you have ever had an MRI, it's an image of the brain. Developmental systems theories are where development is influenced by components that interact over time. Yuri Bronfenbrenner, he developed the Ecological Model, and he believed that developing children are influenced by multiple layers of a system, and there are multiple systems within each system. Dynamic systems theories view development as a constant interplay of multiple factors that include genetics, brain development, mental states, physical states, and the child's environment. And these systems are in constant motion, but eventually settle based on the self-organizing principle. So Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, we see here there are multiple systems. There's actually a 5th system that's been added after he developed this, called the chronal system. The microsystem is what includes the child himself and those things that directly impact that child. So for example, their parents, their siblings, As we get into the mesosystem, which is the next layer, these are things that also influence the child. It could be the child's neighborhood, um, their peers, extended family, their teachers, things like that. So school, maybe their religious setting. The exosystem, these are things that are maybe not directly impacting the child, but are impacting the child through indirect means. So, for example, the parent's workplace. Say your father goes to work and he has a very stressful job. When he comes home from work, he takes that stress out on the family. That will impact the child. So, the child does not have a direct connection to the father's workplace, but he does indirectly because of how that father's workplace impacts his behavior when he interacts with his child. The macro system, these are larger dominant beliefs and ideologies in society, such as policy, laws, other government things. And so if we can think of, what's happening in our country right now with immigration, for example, and DACA laws and things like that. So how immigration laws have changed in our country and how that could impact the child, the child's family, how it impacts schools, etc. We see this as a very holistic approach. Again, not a stage model. So all of these things are interacting together to impact this child's development. Moving on to studying child development, we want to think about how do we use a scientific method to investigate the questions posed by developmental science, and how do research methods differ? Oftentimes, we use observational methods to study child development, and we will be doing a couple of observation papers in this class. Naturalistic observations are where researchers observe the child in the child's natural environment. So, for example, we're going to do a preschool observation paper, and typically, if you were doing a naturalistic observation, you would actually go to a preschool and observe the children in that environment. A structured observation is where researchers place the child in a controlled situation and try to bring about some type of behavior, and then they record the behavior. Much of the research that I have done has been more in structured observations where families would come into my laboratory and I'd place them in a room where I would videotape and try to elicit certain behaviors. Ethnographic methods try to understand the child within the child's cultural group, particularly within non-Western cultures. So here we see a picture of a family in Africa where in an ethnographic study, we would actually go there and observe them in that culture. Self-report methods are also used to study child development, where we use questionnaires or structured interviews. We also use standardized tests. Norms are created through standardization. So say I have a standardized test and I give it to 2,000 kids across the country, where I have a representative sample of the population of the US and those 2,000 students. From those 2,000 student scores, I would be able to find out what the mean score is or the average score, and that would give me a norm. So any student that I give this test to, I have something that's normative, that's standardized, that I can compare it to. I also want to make sure the test is reliable, or that it's consistent over time, and that it's also valid, which means that it's testing what it's supposed to test or measure what it's supposed to measure. Case studies are in-depth accounts of an individual person or a small group of people. And correlation studies gives us the direction and strength of the relationship between two variables. I get a positive correlation, meaning that both variables will move in the same direction. A negative correlation means that they move in opposite directions. For example, if I'm looking at height and weight of children, a positive correlation would mean if height increases, weight increases, meaning they're both going up, they're both going the same direction. Or if kids are shorter, then they weigh less, meaning they're both going down, so it's still a positive relationship. A negative relationship would be that height and weight are going in opposite directions. So a taller kid would weigh less, so that one's going up, the other's going down, or a shorter kid would weigh more. That would also be a negative correlation. A multiple regression is used when an experimental manipulation of variables isn't really possible. So we're able to evaluate the correlations between multiple independent variables and the dependent variables and able to predict a behavior or some measurable outcome using a multiple regression. Experimental designs are used quite a bit in studying child development, and this is typically the type of research that I've done. An independent independent variable is a variable that we manipulate, and a dependent variable is the outcome or what we're trying to measure. Many of you might have heard about drug studies, for example, where we have, say, a new drug for child depression versus a placebo, which is a sugar pill. The independent variable would be the drug, because I can manipulate whether a group gets the new depression drug or no treatment, which is the sugar pill or placebo. The dependent variable would be the depression at the end of the study. So my hope is that children taking this new drug would have decreased depressive symptoms, whereas the placebo group would have no change in their depressive symptoms or maybe even get worse. Laboratory experiments allow researchers to exercise greater control over extraneous variables. So for example, in my depression study, there might be other things contributing to depression. So maybe the family, so maybe the parents are fighting all the time and that makes the child depressed. If I do my study in a lab without the parents around, that might impact the child's depressive symptoms. So that would be more of a laboratory experiment. A field experiment is conducted in a natural setting where this allows a researcher to better understand the variables of interest and how they might operate in real life. And then intervention studies are where we evaluate the outcome of an intervention. So for example, again, with my new drug, that could be considered an intervention study, or I can introduce some new type of therapy where I could have one group have a certain type of therapy and the other group gets no therapy. That would be an intervention study to see if my therapy worked. Developmental research designs, there are several ways to do this. The ideal would be a longitudinal study, and this is where we study something over a long period of time. This is very costly and time consuming, but it does oftentimes give you the best results. Cross-sectional studies is where we look at a cohort effect. So say I have a longitudinal study that I want to do for over 10 years. 10 years is a really long time. That would be a lot of money to follow the same people over 10 years. What I do in a cross-section study over those 10 years is I might have 3 cohorts or 3 groups. So a group of kids at year 1, a group of kids at year 5, and a group of kids at year 10. And I'm doing them all at the same time. So rather than doing a study that's 10 years, I have a cross-sectional study where I have 3 groups over 3 different time periods that would give me that 10-year study. Obviously, there are other variables that you have to control for, but that's the idea. A hybrid design is where we combine a longitudinal cross-sectional design. And here we have to have at least 2 cohorts or 2 groups of children over time, and then we collect data at different time points. Microgenetic designs involve intensive collection of data over short time periods, especially right before a developmental change is likely to occur. And then, long-term intervention studies. In your book, there's an example of the Romanian orphanage studies where we provide some type of intervention and evaluate those effects over a period of time. The summary of ethical guidelines for research in children. As a researcher, we must adhere to very strict guidelines of ethics as we study children. It's very difficult to get an institutional review board or IRB proposal through when you're working with children, because there are a lot more guidelines that we have to follow. One is do no harm. So non-harmful procedures, we want to ensure that there's no psychological or physical harm to any children in our studies. Informed consent must be given, so parents must sign a release. And oftentimes children do not sign consent forms, especially if they're under a certain age, but we ask for child assent, where we ask them if it's okay for them to participate. We explain the risks, the benefits, and the procedures of the research in the informed consent documents. We have to ensure confidentiality, and this provides protection for the participants, their information, as well as their responses. Sometimes this is important, especially if you're doing a questionnaire, for example. If people feel that nobody else will see their responses, they might answer a little more honestly. Deception or debriefing, typically we try our best not to deceive any participants in our study. If we do, we must debrief them, meaning that we have to explain what we did and why we did it if we used any form of deception. Finally, in studying child development, there are many professionals who use developmental science to improve the lives of children. Psychologists and researchers, as they're studying, try to provide information to help the lives of children. Healthcare professionals oftentimes will do the same, and they also will use the research that's been conducted. Educators as well can benefit by knowing a lot of the results of developmental science research. And then policymakers, program directors, and even attorneys will use developmental science to help improve the lives of children. That's it for this chapter, and I look forward to next week's material.